Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Clark Forum tonight. We're excited to have you all here. First, please enjoy this short video about the Rose Walters Prize.
There's so many issues we don't know if we're going to solve them, but we still feel we have to make our best effort, and I certainly think that's true of the fate of the planet.
Everybody can play a role in changing the narrative of the future and changing how we think and responding to the critical issue of climate change today.
I don't think that future generations are going to be able to ignore the issues the way past generations have.
It's a time where our values as human beings can really come into focus.
We need something to bring the attention of the world to climate change. That's what the purpose of our prize is.
The Rose Walters Prize is given each year at Dickinson College to recognize an individual or an organization for the environmental activism work that they've done.
I think it's very important that the human population understands the impact that they are having on not only the climate, but our environment.
If we don't really address it in a major way soon, it may be too late.
The recipient of the Rose Walters Prize receives $100,000. And our hope is that with those resources, the individual is going to be able to continue their work and amplify it in ways that they'll be able to get more attention for what they're doing.
So far, we've selected individuals who have either dedicated their lives or their job has given them the platform to address these issues with the public.
Through this award, what it does is it brings these inspiring people to our campus for a 2 or 3 day residency. That really gives a chance for our students to interact with these people in small group settings, sometimes one-on-one.
It's a very personalized experience. They go and visit classrooms and programs. You know, you just get to ask them questions for an hour of their time, just you and them.
And so our students are able to learn very directly from these people about how does one become an effective advocate for whatever the issue is that they're working on.
If I'm looking at it from like an economic social justice point of view, they're looking at it from a scientific point of view. That helps inform and broaden the scope of my understanding for climate change. And that's a very Dickinsonian liberal arts sort of experience.
What you guys are particularly doing is way out in front of a lot of people.
I think by all accounts, Dickinson is right in the thick of this, that, you know, when people like the Sierra Club rank schools, Dickinson always comes out near the top.
The student body is really gung-ho to figure out how to save the planet, how to address climate change.
I'm really excited to see what you're doing here at Dickinson. You're reshaping the way the leaders of tomorrow are thinking about their future and what they can do and what role they can play.
I think we owe it to the future generations to clean up the mess our generation and past generations have created.
So I hope the prize teaches people many elements of what's happening in our world due to our presence here.
But the world doesn't feel yet in any major way that this is urgent, and it is.
Good evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our 9th annual lecture honoring the recipient of the Sam Rose Class of '58 and Julie Walters Prize for Global Environmental Activism at Dickinson College. I'm so glad to welcome our students, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, and friends who are joining us this evening via live stream. I welcome you all tonight. I'd like to start by offering my deepest thanks to two very devoted Dickinsonians, without whom tonight's lecture and long-standing residency would not be possible. As you just saw in the video, Sam Rose, class of '58, and Julie Walters established this prize to raise awareness of the dangers of climate change. Their commitment and passion to protecting our environment are inspiring to all of us. It's been a privilege and a joy to get to know both Sam and Julie since I came to Dickinson 3 years ago. Let me add that Sam's philanthropy towards Dickinson has extended well beyond this prize to include his unparalleled support of student scholarship. I encourage you to read our board chair, Judge John Jones' column in the upcoming fall Dickinson magazine, in which he shares more about Sam's commitment to access for our students. But for tonight, please join me in thanking both Julie and Sam for their incredible generosity and dedication to our college and to our planet. This year, the Rose Walter Prize honors Armond Cohen, founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force, a leading force in reducing air pollution and climate pollutants in our nation. I know you will enjoy hearing from Armond and learning from him, and he will be introduced shortly. As you saw in the video, he joins a distinguished group of individuals and organizations as prior recipients of the Rose Walter Prize, including the Natural Resource Defense Council, Our Children's Trust, Brett Jenks, CEO of the conservation nonprofit RARE, environmental activist, author, and journalist Bill McGibbon, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Elizabeth Colbert, award-winning actor and environmental activist Mark Ruffalo, former EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, and award-winning nature photographer James Baylog. Because we are virtual this year, Armond will be participating and leading a number of classes and discussions throughout the course of the entire semester, rather than the intensive 2-day residency that our prize recipients normally undertake on campus. I know our students, faculty, and staff are really excited for this ongoing engagement with our honoree. I would now like to introduce Robin Okanoa, who will introduce our speaker. Robin is a senior environmental studies and philosophy double major from Atlanta, Georgia. She was originally drawn to Dickinson because of the college's commitment to sustainability, and throughout her time with us, she has combined her own longstanding commitment to sustainability with her drive for social justice. Robin is involved with the Black Student Union, Divest Dickinson, the Hypnotic Dance Team, the Liberty Caps, and is also a peer advisor in our Center for Advising, Internship, and Lifelong Career Development. She has spent her time at Dickinson strengthening her personal passion for environmental justice and connecting sustainability to social justice through her academics, service, and personal endeavors. She hopes to one day pursue a career in activism and policy. Thanks for being with us. Congratulations to Armond, and I now invite Robin to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, President Ensign. I am excited to be here tonight. When we did hold Clark Forum events in person on campus, we took a moment to acknowledge that the land on which we gathered belonged to Indigenous peoples for centuries prior to European colonization. Currently, I am inhabiting the ancestral land of the Lanai Lenape, the Susquehannock and Conestoga, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Erie, and later, the children of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. I would like to encourage everyone watching this evening's program, especially today, to take a moment after our presentation to acknowledge the tribes whose traditional land you currently inhabit. On behalf of Dickinson College's Center for Sustainability Education and the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Hedgehogs and Foxes, Towards Climate Pragmatism. I have the honor of introducing you all to this year's winner of the Sam Rose and Julie Walters Prize for Global Environmental Activism, Mr. Armond Cohen. Armond is an honors graduate of Harvard Law School and Brown University. He is a member of the Keystone Energy Board and a member of the U.S. Department of Energy Electricity Advisory Committee. As the co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force, Mr. Cohen has made significant impacts on reducing air pollution and climate pollutants from power plants, industries, cars, and trucks. Not only did Mr. Cohen's work identify air pollution as an environmental issue, but a human health issue as well. Armond conceived the initial national campaign, which identified and documented America's coal plants as a major cause of respiratory illness and death, leading to rules that will reduce their emissions by 90% or more by 2050. In addition to that, Mr. Cohen developed a campaign to curb health-damaging pollutants from America's heavy diesel engines. In his talk tonight, Mr. Cohen will be focusing on philosopher Isaiah Berlin's analysis of the difference between the fox and the hedgehog. Isaiah Berlin was an avid pluralist, so it follows then that he would see the fox as a strong kind of thinker. As a philosopher myself, I would like to provide you all with a sound, logical argument about Mr. Cohen. In order to be a fox, one must embrace a well-rounded mindset to address big problems. You must use multiple solutions, taking into consideration complexity, contingency, and risk. In 2000, Armond and the Clean Air Task Force recognized that the switch to renewable energy and increasing energy efficiency alone would not be enough to achieve zero emissions by 2050. As a result, they began to use an economic approach that introduced the first ever price on carbon. Further, Armond Cohen's experience as an environmental lawyer drove him to work with the Clean Air Task Force to regulate global warming pollutants and invest in clean technology. Therefore, Armond Cohen himself is a fox thinker. I want to emphasize the importance of being able to approach the problems we have today with a fox mindset. Here at Dickinson, there's a focus on being fox thinkers. We're able to solve problems and communicate effectively. As an environmental studies and philosophy double major, I have gained the skills I need to go out into the world and think like a fox to make positive change. Mr. Cohen's work with the Clean Air Task Force has been instrumental not only for the environment, but for the health and well-being of people who are affected by climate change. And that inspires me. We are so excited to have Mr. Cohen with us tonight and so grateful to spend the rest of the semester with him for his virtual residency, which kicks off right now. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please type your questions into the live chat next to this YouTube video at any time. Carolina Celadon, a project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues, will be moderating the questions at the end of this presentation. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Mr. Armond Cohen.
Thank you, Robin. That was a lovely introduction. And I feel like I almost don't have to give my talk because you covered it so well. But I will press on here. First of all, thanks very much to Dickinson College for this incredible honor, which is completely unexpected, and to the prize committee that selected me, and of course to Sam and Julie for their generosity to Dickinson and in putting this prize forward. I consider this not only a personal honor, but also a recognition of the work of the Clean Air Task Force, which is the organization that I've been privileged to lead for the last 25 years, and to which the prize money will go for us to continue our work. My main regret is that I can't personally be on campus in the next few weeks to have a direct exchange with students in 3 dimensions rather than 2, but I do look forward to our video sessions and hope that we can have some lively exchange. Now, today I spoke with Robin a little bit, and I warned that my lecture was going to be a little wonky, probably have a few too many slides. So she suggested that I start with a little bit of personal background about what brought me to this work, what keeps me at it, and if I had any wisdom to offer students who are interested in this or related fields. I'm not going to vouch for the wisdom part, but I can tell you a little bit about how I got into this work and what keeps me at it, and maybe there's some lessons there for you. As to origins, I actually can remember the exact moment when I became interested in being an environmental advocate. I was born and raised in Maryland, and on one family vacation on the Delaware shore, I must have been 14 or 15 years old, I noticed that every day around mid-afternoon, the tides in the ocean would carry in a line of really disgusting yellow scum that made the ocean unswimmable. And I asked my father, who was a civil engineer, what was up. He knew a lot about these things. He actually been a sewage engineer in DC in his first job. And he said it was pretty simple. Philadelphia and Wilmington didn't have secondary sewage treatment as the law required So we got their stuff, all their biological nasties, flushed down the Delaware River into the Atlantic Ocean. This was about 1972, just about the time that the Clean Water Act had passed. I then got a 1-hour lecture on the differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary sewage treatment. On that day, I think I learned two things. One, that technology is part of solving big environmental problems. And second, that legislation and law matters. I think I learned a third lesson, actually, which was never to ask my father to explain anything complicated, because you could end up with a very long lecture on a very hot summer afternoon. In fact, you may feel the same way after this evening, after I finish speaking. The second thing, though, apart from very personal experiences, I want to add is by way of intellectual background and intellectual influences. And I'm going to actually share my screen here, because I want to start by honoring a couple of my predecessors in that regard. Let's see if we can go full screen here. First of all, Bill McKibben in The End of Nature, one of the previous honorees, really got me going on this topic. I read this book in 1991, I think it was. And, you know, Bill was way ahead of the curve in his book, which really had the thesis that Earth had ceased to be a self-regulating system, and that the imprint of man was so pervasive that effectively people were in control of not just the biology of the planet, but also the geology to some extent. This was 10 years before Dr. Crutzen coined the term the Anthropocene, that is the era of men. And what's interesting about that is that I think now it's common wisdom that the biggest influence on Earth's environment and climate is human beings. But that wasn't so well understood at the time. And that's what he meant by the end of nature, not literally the end of nature, but the end of nature in quotes, as something that is independent of human existence. And then Elizabeth Colbert, another honoree, also published a brilliant series of articles during the 2000s, which I think were the first real articulation of the climate science in a way that lay people could understand who were not going to focus on computer models. And this also had an influence. But I also would be remiss in saying that in omitting the fact that another big influence on me was this rather more obscure book by an engineer named Samuel Floorman, who wrote a brilliant book called The Existential Pleasures of Engineering, which I would commend to you, and I think still holds up very well today. And essentially, I was a sort of 19-year-old wannabe hippie when I read this book. But this book really shook me up. It was sort of a Valentine to well-crafted big technology, and particularly the unglamorous technology of roads, bridges, and power. It didn't land so well initially in my thinking. This was the era of appropriate technology, and small is beautiful would be the solution to everything. And just to give you an idea of how contrarian Floorman was, one of his chapters is titled "Small is Dubious." But over time, this book, although I initially resisted some of its ideas, did lead me to question some of the prevailing wisdom of the day. And you'll probably see some influence of that in my talk tonight as well. In any event, the long and short of it is that I went to law school to learn how to solve problems, and a course on energy law that involved some really cool simulated trials really hooked me in. And then I got a dream job actually working on energy and environmental law as my first job for a small nonprofit in New England working on energy efficiency and renewable energy. Indeed, my first assignment was to try and stop the financing of the Seabrook nuclear power plant. You'll appreciate the irony on that as my talk proceeds. As to what keeps me going, I'd have to say two things. First of all, this climate change is a really scary problem. And if we don't solve it, we're going to have hell to pay. The second thing I could say is that while I'd like to claim that I'm completely an idealist on this matter, it's also a fascinating problem to work on, just intellectually, one of the most complicated issues I think that people will ever deal with. And it draws in every possible sort of discipline you could imagine: physics, chemistry, biology, economics, political science, communications, decision theory, psychology, philosophy, and the arts, but most of all, critical thinking. And indeed, that's everything that Dickinson and similar select liberal arts colleges teach you how to do. So I hope that some of the ideas tonight will be received in that spirit and will be congruent with that training. As to wisdom, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to offer, but I'm going to try this. I'm being honored tonight for environmental activism, and that's great. And activism is really important, and it's a lot of what moves the world. But I think that also thinking deeply about things is good too. Seek out information, critically look at arguments and evidence. That's a really good thing to be doing. So in short, I'd urge you to be a thinktivist as well as an activist, to continually evaluate the information you're getting, seek out new information and even contrary views. I mean, after all, climate change is a massive problem. It took us 200 years to get here. We maybe have 30 or 40 years to unravel it. And then with a nod to Samantha Power, maybe next to genocide, climate change may be the biggest problem from hell that we have. So it's going to take all the brain cells that we possibly have. So I guess my wisdom is this: read widely, keep your mind open on strategies to solutions to address climate change. And that sort of brings me to the theme of my talk, which I am going to use slides to illustrate, and I apologize in advance for that. Let me see if I can move forward. So the title of my talk is Hedgehogs and Foxes Towards Climate Pragmatism. So let's start by defining some terms here. Robin noted Isaiah Berlin's pluralism, which I think is a great word to describe his thinking. And he was a philosopher that very activist as well, not just a philosopher, but someone who led a very strong public life on the issues of his day. But this essay has always stuck with me because the fundamental thesis of the essay is taken from a fragment, really, from the poet Archilochus, which goes as follows: "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And this was elaborated a little bit in the book. And he says, you know, there basically exists a great chasm between those on one side who relate everything to a single central vision, and on the other side, those who pursue many ends, moving on many levels, often unrelated. And I think that's something to keep in mind as we tackle something as complex as climate change. Now, the other word that I use in my introductory title is pragmatist. And I think that's worth looking at for a second too. I think sometimes pragmatists are, you know, people say, well, pragmatist is just someone who does what's, you know, everyone else thinks is the easy thing to do, or is the least that you can get by with, or whatever. But there actually is a very interesting depth in the definition. And the first is that a pragmatist is someone who's guided more by practical considerations than by ideals. Now, that's not to say that ideals aren't important, and I'll return to that later, but practical considerations count for a lot to a pragmatist. And the second is an advocate of what I would call an experimental approach that evaluates theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application in the real world. So there's two ideas in here. One is to focus on the practical. The second is to be open to evidence and experiment. Now, I'm going to jump into a fair number of slides here that sort of try and bound the climate problem. And you'll have to bear with me. You know, as I said, it's a complicated topic. And in fact, sometimes I tell people that if your head doesn't hurt really badly after going through this discussion, then you're not paying attention, because it is complicated. And I think that understanding the complexities is going to be critical to actually solving the problem. Let's begin with a simple fact. We're really losing badly in this war. This is a plot of CO2 emissions on the planet since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or late Industrial Revolution. As you can see, it's been a steady upward curve. What's really interesting to note here is that roughly half the emissions have occurred since 1996, which was the year of the Kyoto Protocol, when the world decided to really start tackling global climate emissions. So our policies aren't exactly having a spectacular impact. You can see that we've actually worsened the problem by a factor of 2 since we agreed to solve it. Now, this is what the models, climate models, will tell us we have to do. Here we are in 2020, and then to solve or to remain within the guardrails of what climate science says is necessary to preserve a planet similar to what we have today, we would essentially need to be at zero emissions by mid-century. And then we have to go into negative emissions, which I'm not going to talk much about tonight. But even if we're lucky enough to get negative emissions, we still need to be at zero out the smokestack by 2050. And if we don't have those zero emissions or negative emissions, we'll have to be there a lot sooner, which is probably unlikely. So this is where we are. We're not doing very well. We've been on a steady upward curve. There was a little dip in the COVID recession. We seem to be rebounding, and we will be below where we are last year, but the steady upward curve continues. This tells you what the gap is. If you put that declining curve against where we actually are, you can see that we have a long, steep drop. If we want to meet 2-degree targets, which is the target that's was originally considered to be the global target, we need to be on a very, very steep ramp now. We have to be on an even steeper ramp if we want to confine planetary warming to 1.5 degrees. And as you can see from the black line, we've just sort of begun to level off a little bit. And if we extrapolate from all the pledges the world governments have made in the blue, you can see that we're still going to go on an upward curve, even if we drop a bit from the current COVID recession. So that's a big gap, as you can see, and we're headed in the wrong direction. Now, that's a lot of bad news. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that public opinion, due in part to people like Bill and Elizabeth Colbert and others, public opinion really has shifted on this issue. And over the years, we've seen much more agreement, even across political parties, about the need to deal with global climate change. This is a recent poll from, I believe, Gallup, and it says that dealing with global climate change, at least by Americans, is considered to be a top priority for the president and Congress. 52% agree with that proposition. Now, getting anyone to agree that something is a top priority on anything, to get a majority to agree on that is a big challenge. But this is a good indication. Globally, the numbers are actually even stronger. The US is actually near the bottom of the pack in terms of percent agreeing that we need to act on climate change. But again, what's also happened is that the percentage of Americans who are very concerned about climate has increased substantially. So as you can see, this is from a recent survey from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. 30% of Americans are alarmed, 26% are concerned, and 16% are cautiously evaluating. But that's a firm majority that you would put sort of in the activist camp, folks who really believe we ought to act on this really urgently. And as I said, globally, you can see this is a survey of public opinion on the urgency of climate as a major threat. And interestingly, we see that the US is sort of down in the bottom quartile, but the world feels even stronger. And it's not like nothing's happening in the United States, although more is happening at the state level than at the federal level. This is a map of all the utilities and all the states in the United States that have agreed to a zero carbon emissions goal by mid-century or earlier. That's a lot of real estate that's already agreed to this. In fact, we recently calculated that 50% of US electric sales are either coming from a company or are occurring in a state where zero emissions are required by mid-century. So politicians and companies are responding. Our federal government, for a variety of reasons, is not at the moment, although we can discuss some of that in the Q&A perhaps. The real question that I want to talk about is going from the why, because I think we've convinced really the majority of Americans and certainly the world as a whole as to why we need to act on climate change. The issue really is how. And to some extent, I think the how will really determine how fast we go. Let's start with some basic facts. And I'm going to focus a lot on energy tonight because if we look at the sources of global greenhouse gas emissions, we see that energy and industry is responsible for 75% of those emissions. Everything else, whether it's land use changes like deforestation or agriculture, is about 25%. And that's important, but since, as Willie Sutton said, you rob banks because that's where the money is, we're going to talk about energy because that's where the emissions are. Now, this is super complicated. I'm not going to go through this chart, but it just sort of shows you how totally intertwined energy is with all of our existence, whether it's industry or it's commercial building heat or residential building heat or cement or steel or electricity or transport. Energy is life, and it's what makes our civilization possible. Now, the other starting point when we think about CO2 emissions is the fact is that 80% of our energy on the planet comes from fossil fuels that are untreated. This number has been stable for about 30 years. That is, we simply haven't budged off that number, even as energy has increased. So the proportion of 80% fossil fuels has remained. This is a chart that shows you that coal in the gray represents almost the biggest share. Oil is the largest share in green at the bottom. Red is natural gas. The light orange is nuclear energy, and blue is hydro, and the orange is renewables. We'll get back to that in a minute. But the first thing I want to emphasize is that at the same time that we need to decrease carbon emissions to zero, we're going to be increasing energy use. This is going to be a really tough challenge because the world's going to need more energy, not less. This is the planet at night from space. And as you can see, there are parts of the world that are very, very well lit, primarily the United States in its urbanized east, as well as the EU. And you can see that there are parts of the planet with significantly larger populations than in the OECD that are not so well lit. And this kind of points to the fact that the developing world is where the energy demand growth is and is going to be. By mid-century, we would expect most energy demand to be coming from what we would call the developing world or the global south. And increasingly, it's going to be concentrated in large urban centers that are going to be using a lot of energy. The UN predicts that by 2050, roughly 70% of people on the planet will be living in large urban areas. And just to kind of put that in perspective, what that means is adding the equivalent of one New York City every 2 months between now and 2050. So that's the kind of urbanization growth or rapidity of urbanization we're going to see on the planet with its attendant energy use. Now, again, on terms of global equity, we can see that this is going to make a big difference because today, people in Africa don't really consume much energy on average. In Asia, they consume a bit more. In the EU, double or more than that. And in North America, here's where we are. The point really here is that one way or the other, as the global south urbanizes, becomes richer, places like Africa and Asia will demand more energy as they have the right to do. And it's true that North America and EU can conserve somewhat, but I don't think this is a problem that we're entirely going to conserve our way out of. The result is that most of the models would tell you that energy use is on its way up. This is from the most recent publication of the International Energy Association with 3 different scenarios. But what's interesting is that even in the sustainable development scenario, which is their most optimistic scenario about managing the energy transition, you can see that we actually are still expecting an increase to about 2030, and then perhaps a decline thereafter. And we'll talk in a second about whether that's plausible. It's also notable that by 2040, a very substantial portion of the planet's energy is still expected to come from fossil fuels. Now, what do we do about this? And this is where it gets really interesting and we get into Fox territory. Because if you spend any time on this topic, it's really easy to get confused because there's just so much literature out there and so many claims. We hear that we need to price carbon. We need to do direct regulation of carbon. We need energy efficiency. We need to electrify everything. We need solar. We need wind. We need to change agricultural practices. We need to do carbon capture and sequestration. We need hydrogen. We need direct air capture of carbon dioxide. We need energy storage. We need nuclear fission. We need fusion energy. We need natural solutions, planting more trees. We need to deploy. We have all we need today. No, we actually need R&D. my reaction to this, and I guess the ultimate kind of Fox view of this is, yes, we need it all. And I truly believe that we're going to need it all, because a problem of this size that's taken 200 years to create, with something like 25 or 30 trillion dollars of capital stock invested in our energy infrastructure, it's going to need a lot of levers to move. An analogy I'd offer for your consideration is something like managing the coronavirus. So we have a variety of approaches here, and it's wise, I think, to do what we're doing, which is to focus on multiple vaccines, multiple kinds of vaccines, not just variations of the same thing. And as you can see, we're moving through trial phases here, starting with about 30 and going through the phases. And hopefully, by the end of that, at least one or two or three different vaccine approaches will work. But this is the fundamental concept of optionality or risk hedging or plurality in approaches to solving big problems. A more humble analogy would be multiple shots on goal. The more shots you take, the more balls you kick, the more likely it is you're going to actually land one in the end zone, in the net. So these are fairly intuitive concepts, but sometimes it's forgotten in the climate debate, where people get curiously stuck on one or another solution. I want to, since I spent 12 years of my life working on energy efficiency and actually pushing some of the largest, what became some of the largest programs in the world in New England, spending billions of dollars on retrofitting buildings, I think energy efficiency can contribute a lot. This is a chart of the world since 1990, sort of baseline to 2000. And what it attempts to do is show what's happening to the economy of the world, energy use, the amount of CO2 per unit of energy use, and the amount of energy per unit of GDP. And what this chart will tell you, if you look at the blue line, is we've actually made a lot of progress in the last 20 years in becoming much more energy efficient. That is, we use much less energy per unit of economic output. Now, some believe that's because the world's moving more towards a digitized service economy, but some of it's technical efficiency. We're just making things that are more efficient. Our buildings are more efficient. But I think what I want you to notice about this chart is that even as energy efficiency has increased substantially, we still have a growth in absolute demand for energy. And that's really because still energy, while it's been somewhat decoupled from economic growth, is still moving directionally with economic growth. So we still have this problem that as the economies increase, as people consume more stuff, as they live, they want more light, they want more heat, they want more transport, they want more mobility. We still have a problem of growing energy use, which I don't think is prudent to assume that efficiency will take an enormous whack out of. Now, if we think about the system as a whole, we have many options. This is a very simplified chart of what a completely zero carbon energy system on the planet might look like. At the top, we have what are called the end uses, and there are really only three categories of end use. There's buildings, there's transport, and then there's industry. And we have two basic means of delivering zero carbon energy. We have electricity, and then we have zero carbon fuels, which are most likely going to be hydrogen based. On the bottom, we have many forms of primary zero carbon energy, primary energy production that can feed electricity and zero carbon fuels. We have renewable energy like wind and sun and hydroelectricity. We have nuclear energy. And then we have stripping carbon out of fossil fuels, actually using fossil fuels, but stripping out the carbon in a process called carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. And there's a lot of complexity behind this chart, but these are the basic moving parts. And I want to spend kind of a few minutes on each of them to illustrate why I think plurality and Fox-like thinking is very important. Let's start with renewable energy, which I spent a good part of my career working on, tried to site wind plants in places like Maine, and still believe very strongly that renewables will likely provide more than half of global energy, certainly by 2050, if not before. So I think renewables can do a lot of the job, perhaps most of the job, but I do have some concerns, as I think many others who look at this do. The first is a question of pace. This is a wonderful chart that will show you how rapidly renewable energy has increased on the planet since 1999. And it has been an astounding and exponential increase in these 20 years, which is much to be celebrated. But when we zoom back and we look at the total energy picture on the planet, we see that those renewables really just add up to this bright orange line or bar. So while we're gaining, we're still, a very small drop in the bucket. By the way, nuclear energy is not doing that much better. That's the lighter orange. We'll get back to that in a second. But the point here is that even if we were wildly successful and we're able to continually and exponentially increase, it's going to be a long haul to get to 2050 and rely only on renewable energy. One of the problems we have also with renewable energy is that it is seasonal. And, I think a lot of folks think, well, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, but the sun does shine every day. So if we just had batteries to deal with the nighttime, daytime thing, and if we had batteries to deal with the wind when it's not blowing, we'd be okay. But this is, I apologize for the complexity of this chart. This is California over the year. And the dark black line is the amount of demand there is for electricity over the year. And the dotted line is the output of wind and solar energy if you combine them 50-50 in California. And as you can see, California would have a surplus in the summer months, but have a deficit in the winter and fall months. So we don't just have just a daily problem that batteries can easily deal with, but we have a seasonal problem, which becomes much, much more expensive to deal with. We're also going to have the problem of putting stuff on the landscape. I think we all have this image of wind power, for example, as being, and I think these towers are beautiful and elegant personally. This is the kind of picture you typically see. But if we're going to scale, say, wind power or solar power, it's going to be a very different kind of landscape. And this is an example from one of California's large wind farms. This only represents about 1/10 of that wind farm. It's land intensive. It's essentially industrial use of land, which is fine, and I support. But one has to question if we're really going to be able to sustain this all the way to zero carbon. Some work that was recently done looking at Iowa noted that ordinances are springing up all over Iowa, even though Iowa is a very pro-wind state. At least Senator Grassley from Iowa believes it's great because the farmers get paid. But people living near wind farms, have some other thoughts. And this represents basically a proliferation of ordinances that have blossomed in the last 5 or 6 years, including outright moratoria on wind, setbacks of a 1/4 mile or more that make wind development very, very difficult. And this is in a state that's relatively hospitable to wind. I can tell you personally from trying to site a wind plant in Maine that there are parts of the country that are much less hospitable to wind energy. Industrial scale solar also, I apologize for the blurry image, looks a little bit more like this than the more picturesque, sort of rooftop or small clusters. This is the kind of land use that we're looking at. Transmission, of which we're going to require a lot if we go the renewable route to tie together variable wind and solar so that it's balancing each other at different times. Transmission is not popular. This is from my neck of the woods in New England. This is a transmission line that's now bounced around through 3 states. It's taken 12 years and it's still subject to a referendum in Maine this election season. So this is not going to be easy. This is an example of a recent study projecting solar development. This is wind development globally as projected through 2023 to meet the sort of full renewable, 100% renewable target. As you can see, somewhere around 2020, magic begins to happen, and we get this kind of curve. I felt a little deja vu because I looked back recently at what people had predicted about nuclear power back in the mid-70s. This is a plot of several different predictions of nuclear power expansion back in the mid-70s. A lot of people were very optimistic that nuclear would provide, a majority or even 75% of global power demand. And the bottom yellow line is what really happened. So I think we need to be cautious about predictions. As a famous philosopher, Yogi Berra once said, beware of predictions, especially about the future. I think we have to have a certain amount of humility when we look at these models and predictions. The other thing I want you to kind of take home is that we talk a lot about electricity, and that's where the action is as far as renewables goes. But as far as global energy demand and global carbon dioxide, fuels rule, and they still rule. 80% of the planet's energy is not electricity. It's actually oil, gas, and coal used for transportation and industry and heat. And these are sectors that are going to be very difficult to electrify. Steel mills, cement plants, long-haul shipping, both land-based shipping and marine shipping, aviation, building heat are all examples. Now, it could be that we can electrify a significant portion of those end uses, but it will be a challenge. If we're talking about land use constraints in expanding renewable energy to supply electricity, we're talking about land use constraints on steroids to provide and displace all oil and gas. This is a plot recently done by some of our colleagues at a firm called Lucid Catalyst that looks at what kind of land area and ocean area would Japan have to set aside to use only wind and solar to displace its oil and gas demand. And the magenta area is what would be required by way of offshore wind to do that. And the yellow area is what would be required by way of solar to provide, to create the hydrogen to displace oil and gas. By contrast, if one had a more concentrated heat source, whether it was nuclear or gas with carbon capture and storage, probably nuclear in the case of Japan, which has all kinds of issues, of course. Nonetheless, you can see the land area there is quite tiny compared to the amount of area that would be required for wind and solar. Now, I've really spent a lot of time here on renewables, and I don't mean to single renewables out because I can do the same thing for any energy source. They all have their challenges. I've alluded to nuclear and my checkered past on that topic, but I think what's important to note is that any of these sources has problems. It can be said that nuclear has been a very powerful way to decarbonize electric grids in the past. This is a picture of energy in France between 1960 and about 1980. And you can see that, that by the mid 80s, France had gotten rid of most of its fossil energy on its power grid in blue as it increased nuclear energy. So now today, about 80% of the French power grid is zero carbon due to the introduction of nuclear power. But nuclear has a lot of problems. First of all, it's costly relative to other sources. It takes a long time to deliver under our current construction models. We need a new delivery model. And of course, there's the issue of public acceptance. People fear radiation. They fear waste, and they are concerned about safety of nuclear plants. Now, I can talk to you about all the new designs and the advanced technology that makes nuclear much less expensive, is likely to make it much easier to deliver, more like a conventional power plant, much safer. But this will take work and it will take a lot of discussion. One version of this, just to give you a sense of how, if we could make nuclear work, how powerful it could be in decarbonizing the global economy. This is a picture of an example of what would be basically concentrated small modular nuclear reactors in the middle. And just to give you a feel for, this is one industrial complex with 36 coupled small nuclear reactors. 5 of these industrial sites could provide all the power for Pennsylvania every single year. 10 of these sites could provide all the oil and gas consumption through hydrogen production over the course of a year. So while nuclear has its challenges, it might also have a lot of promise. But I don't mean to understate the challenges, because getting to this technology and moving through all the issues is, like as with renewables, is going to be very, very difficult and challenging. There are other options out there like fusion. Some people used to joke, and still do, that fusion is 20 years away and it always will be. But there actually is a lot of activity in this space, and commercial companies that are actually moving this technology forward. I'm trying to work with many of them to kind of figure out what the regulatory and research and development pathway is. But we are experiencing a kind of a renaissance of fusion activity, which is not so much science-based as it is engineering-based. There's work going on in decarbonizing fossil fuels. This is a pilot plant in Texas that produces gas-fired electric power while eliminating or sequestering all of the carbon from the gas stream that goes into the power plant. This is an article that appeared in Science magazine a couple years ago. If they are successful, and there are others that are experiencing along this line, we could be using natural gas as a complement to renewables and nuclear, and doing it without any carbon emissions. And we do have experience with injecting carbon underground once we've extracted it. This will probably be necessary, even if not for the power sector, for industrial processes like cement that inherently produce carbon dioxide in the process. We also have demonstrations of hydrogen generated from stripping the carbon out of natural gas. This is the Quest project in Alberta that is already doing that today. We have other options that my organization is exploring, like deep hot rock geothermal, in which water is injected 5 to 7 miles underground into deep, dry, hot rock, which produces a supercritical steam that can then come back up and turn a turbine in a power plant. Zero carbon power, very, very efficient, is still in the R&D stage, but has a lot of promise because this deep, hot rock is available anywhere in the world. And if it can be proven, you could take an existing coal plant and use the steam that's produced underground, knock out the coal boiler, and use the equipment to run on the steam coming from geothermal. So why am I going through all these examples? Because I really believe, and I think any decent mathematical analysis will say, that if you have more options, you're more likely to be successful. And I'm not going to go through this chart except to say it's a pretty standard probability tree. The point really is that even if you believe, let's say that there are 3 different hurdles you have to pass for any technology. Is it technically proven? Is it commercially competitive? And is it socially acceptable? Even if your chance of success, the answer being yes to any one of those 3, or all of those 3, if you multiply the uncertainties, the no's, you end up with basically a coin flip, 50-50, that you'll actually achieve decarbonization. So it stands to reason that the more of these options we have, the more likely it is that we'll achieve success. And I'm just going to end with a couple other quotes from Isaiah Berlin. This is from a different essay of his called The Pursuit of the Ideal. And it really goes to the inherent, I guess, conflicts or tragedy of human affairs, which is the notion of the perfect whole, the ultimate solution in which all good things coexist, seems to me to be not merely unobtainable, that is a truism, but conceptually incoherent. We are doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irreparable loss. The other thing that I think Berlin is really good at is really forcing you to confront your own biases. And this is a quote I love from him, back from The Hedgehog and the Fox, which is, "The number of causes upon which events turn is too great for human knowledge or calculation. We know too few facts, and we select them at random and in accord with our own subjective inclinations." And so I'm going to just try one slide summary here of everything I've said. First of all, although I've been a little bit circumspect, skeptical, maybe even a little bit down in my thinking, I want to leave you with a positive message, which is I believe we can manage climate change if we embrace the size of the problem and truly recognize what we're up against, and we actively develop multiple options, and we check our cognitive biases at the door as much as we humanly can, and are willing to take the grown-up position that there are going to be some real-world trade-offs. So on that note, I'm going to retract my original thesis, which is that we must all be only foxes. I think we must all be hedgehogs and we must all be foxes. The hedgehog part of it is to keep our eye on the ball, which is that the planet is not in particularly good shape right now, and we need to be very, very focused on preserving the planetary ecosystem as it exists. But to do that, we also have to be fox-like in the way we approach it. So with that, I appreciate your attention and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cohen, for your valuable insights. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers did too. This marks the question and answer session portion of our program. We will take as many questions as time permits. So a little reminder to our viewers to continue to post questions in the live chat next to this YouTube video. So with that being said, our first question is, what role do you think culture change needs to take place in order to address the energy issue, i.e. addressing consumerism, capitalism, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I'm going to answer that two ways. As you've probably gathered by now, I'm probably going to put my bet more on technology than human culture change. I think it would be great if we could start by North America consuming energy more like the Europeans do. That would cut energy use in half for sure. So I think that in the developed world, where we already have lots of stuff, I think that is plausible path to success and a very important one. As I noted earlier, I don't know what you tell folks in Africa or Asia about conserving when they don't really have the material comforts that we do yet. So I think it's kind of a two-speed world when it comes to that. I will say also, I'm somewhat pessimistic about the ability to change behavior en masse through culture change. We have seen some of that, but I think that we have to be very, very, very cautious about that. That said, it's always worth focusing on, but I think if we're really going to kind of count on or hope for great success, in the end, it's the machines. You could say it's the people that cause the pollution, but in the end, it's the machines that we use that cause the pollution, and that's the approach that I've chosen to take, which is not to say that other approaches aren't important and complementary. So I realize that's sort of dodging the question. Maybe I'm trying to have it both ways, but I do think that that's another example of fox-like thinking. We have to proceed on two fronts at once.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are your primary energy sources moving forward, if you have one?
Yeah, I just think, some of those charts showed you, I just believe that we were just in a position of radical uncertainty. If you had told me, 20 years ago that wind energy would be producing 7% of American electric power today, I would have said you were crazy, because I'd only seen one wind plant down in Hull, Massachusetts, and it was wildly expensive. So I think it's very, very hard to predict. I think they all have advantages. I think that clearly renewable energy at scale, at some reasonable scale, has a lot of social and public support. And that's a great advantage for it. It's also relatively cheap when it's done, at least as a part of a system, not the entire system. I mentioned that problem of seasonality. So I would say solar, certainly in the sunnier parts of the world, is clearly going to be the big source for the next 10 to 20 years. Again, when we jump up against that, start bumping up against that seasonal problem, it may diminish. I think I work a lot on nuclear. I co-founded something called the Nuclear Innovation Alliance because I believe that technology has a promise. I think there's a long way to go there. A lot of things have to be proven. I think if it could be gotten on a better track, I think it could scale very rapidly, and we might see the kind of progress, say, that we saw in France in the 1970s. Carbon capture and storage, I think, is also potentially quite large. We have a very large oil and gas industry. it could be repurposed to produce zero carbon energy. It might actually bring those folks along into the discussion, and we're seeing oil and gas companies begin to become interested in it. So I would just say, it's hard to say. I mean, an easy answer would be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But I think the hydrogen question, we have to get rid of oil and gas in transportation and industry. And I think for hydrogen, I think it's going to be a tough row to hoe. I would probably put my bet more on using fossil fuel with carbon capture to produce that in the short term, maybe nuclear in the long run. I don't see renewable energy scaling to provide a huge percentage of that, whereas I think renewables will be more dominant in electricity. But those predictions are as good as anyone's, and I caution you not to go out and make any bets on Wall Street on those.
Thank you. The U.S. is poised either to benefit or suffer from climate change. How can policymakers, local, state, and federal, be smart and figure out how to minimize the downsides and capitalize on the upsides?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, especially with a potential change in administration and certainly what's likely to be a shift in Congress. I think there are a couple of really huge opportunities here. The first is to really push hard on the development of the stuff we have. And that means building a heck of a lot of wind and solar as rapidly as we can, as fast as we can, and energy storage to complement those sources. So I think the first opportunity we have, which nicely coincides with the coronavirus recession and our need to come out of that, is really to unleash a lot of investment. It will create a lot of jobs, a lot of manufacturing, although some of the components will come from overseas. So I think that's the near-term opportunity, is to really scale up what we have in hand today. I think we should also begin to plant the seeds for some of the technologies that I spoke of earlier, the complementary technologies, some of which are really not even fully commercially demonstrated yet. So that's number one, is spend and start investing in the expansion of a clean energy base, and that will assist with our economic recovery. The second is setting a long-term goal for carbon, and there are several bills. That map I showed you earlier of the United States shows that 7 states and numerous utilities, I think we're up to 24 utilities, have now set zero carbon objectives. So, but getting those put into law will set a target. It'll send a signal to the market that we can't burn coal anymore. Gas has a very limited lifetime in the power sector. And the kind of market creation effect and innovation effect that will create, I think, will be enormous. So that's the second biggest thing we can do. Maybe the first and most important, perhaps. That will have a tougher slog in Congress, frankly, even if Democrats take the House and Senate and the presidency. There's still many states like Pennsylvania, where you're sitting now, that still are, the economies are substantially tied to natural gas. So I think the notion of a rapid move to a carbon cap of some kind is going to take a little while longer, but I think that's also a very important policy. So those are the two things. I think it's technology, investment, and a policy to limit carbon. And those two things together, I think, will really move us down the curve much faster.
Thank you. How do we get businesses / corporations on board to practice more sustainable methods and help combat climate change, especially those with vested interests in fossil fuels?
That's a great question. Well, one thing we've seen is that some of the big commercial buyers of energy, just to take the energy thing for a second, we saw Google come out. We've seen actually numerous corporations come out and say they want to go either 100% renewable energy or they want to go 100% zero carbon, which are not always the same things for the reason I mentioned. You can claim to be getting renewable energy all the time, but you're probably really not, because of the seasonal variations in availability. But the fact is, several hundred corporations representing some very large percentage, I can't quote it off the top of my head, of US corporate activity has made these kinds of pledges. That's had an enormous effect on the market. Renewable energy is doing much better than it otherwise would, simply under the law through this voluntary demand. So the one thing that corporations can do is to create demand for these products. As you probably took from my talk, I think that should be a zero carbon demand rather than just only a renewable energy demand. But I think that it's all directionally correct. Now, the other interesting thing and it's really kind of the $60 trillion question is, what are the fossil fuel companies going to do about all of this? I would say that they're thinking, and I think they're seeing their stock prices drop not only due to depressed demand from coronavirus, but due to this energy transition. And I think they see the transition coming. And there have been a variety of responses. I think some of the more forward-thinking ones are thinking, well, maybe we should think about a product that has zero carbon. So they're getting very interested in at least one of the technologies I described, which can strip carbon out of gas and use it to make hydrogen. And we see a lot of companies, particularly in Europe, now focusing on that. I mean, even the Saudis announced that they were going to be developing a project to use the natural gas produced in Saudi Arabia, stripping out carbon and providing hydrogen for export. So I think some of these large fossil fuel companies are beginning to smell the coffee. Remember that half of the oil and gas produced in the world is not produced by private companies, it's produced by governments or essentially government-owned entities. So the chances that policy could really influence this in a good way. China, which of course owns all of its oil and gas operations, is also pledged to net zero carbon. So it's kind of hard to separate governments from oil and gas. And I think we're seeing a real sea change. We'll see how far that goes. There've been a lot of pronouncements in the last few weeks, but we'll see how fast people will move.
Thank you. What do you think is the biggest thing holding us back right now to making a real difference in terms of climate change?
So I think the biggest, that's a great question. It's so simple, but it's so hard to answer. Because it's more like death by 1,000 cuts, honestly. I think, well, okay, let's start with the obvious, which is that the Congress hasn't passed a law to contain carbon. And that really would change things very radically, very quickly. So that's big in the United States. The states have moved in that direction, and it is in the 7 states that have enacted clear statutes requiring zero carbon targets. We are beginning to see utility companies scramble to figure out what to do. And that's a good scrambling. That's the kind of scrambling you want to see. So I think that probably the biggest failing right now is the failure to set a clear binding target. I don't think the planet as a whole will ever set that. It's going to be states and localities. The second biggest problem is we don't really have the variety of options we need today to scale. And that's why I went through that litany of other options. Again, renewables are fantastic. They're going to take us a very long way. Do I think they're going to get us there by 2050 by themselves? I think that's a risky proposition. They might, and we could get really lucky. So I think the other part of it is we don't really have a functional nuclear power industry globally that can deliver in time and at reasonable cost. And the carbon capture industry is in its nascency. So that's the lack of options or complements is another thing that we need to really work on. But those are the two big things, law and technology.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a member of Divest Dickinson, which is an organization on campus campaigning for an end to financial investment in fossil fuels by our college. And the question is, considering the trade-offs inherent to energy that you describe, how important do you believe it is to try to force a transition away from fossil fuels via divestment?
So I'm not going to address the divestment question, but because I think people can debate that tactically. I will say, and I'll just be right out front about it, I think what you saw from my presentation is I think that fossil energy could play a role, at least in a transition, if we can strip the carbon out of it and sequester it. I have no philosophical objection to that. I think it's technically challenging, but we are demonstrating it around the world. And I think if I believed that we were going to get to zero carbon in 2050 only on non-fossil sources, I wouldn't take that position, but I think we need that option. So I'll just answer flatly. I don't think we should rule fossil out, certainly as part of a multi-decade transition, maybe at the end point. If I felt more strongly that nuclear and renewables could do it all, I'd give you a different answer, but that's my honest answer today.
Thank you. How are humans to minimize the impact of the waste that comes from some renewable energy sources? So examples would be solar panels that have decayed, other parts from worn out renewable energy sources.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on that topic, or even having read very much. I think that there, it's the usual kit bag of solutions, recycling, and careful attention. I'm more worried about, frankly, what's going to happen in countries that don't have the kinds of solid waste disposal laws that we used to have in this country, but have been eviscerated in the last few years. So I don't have a clear answer. I have read enough to know that there are ways to deal with that. It is true that again, I'm not going to pick on renewables because they are really critical, but they do have an end of life issue that we haven't really confronted in a big way yet, mostly because it's only been 20 years since we really got big in terms of the amount of renewable installations we have. So I don't have a technical answer, but maybe that's something that I know there are a lot of people out there working on it right now.
Our next question starts off with a little blurb. It says, it's clear that the US plays a key role in environmental global politics, i.e. enabling/persuading other countries to not support environmental initiatives like the Paris Agreement. It's also clear that climate action is dependent on policymakers and taking into account that the current administration has shown a blatant disregard for climate change. How do you see climate action unraveling if Trump stays in office?
Well, yeah, so I think on the plus side, the states are moving in the United States. So I showed you that map, and 50% of US electric sales are already basically under a zero carbon trajectory. So that's hopeful. I think we're gonna get more states on board. I'm working in 3 or 4 that I think in the next year will go that direction. So regardless of what Washington does, I think there's a lot of hope at the state level. I also think the fact that the companies themselves are moving in this direction bodes very, very well. And I'm glad I don't own coal stocks and never did, because they're in the dumper, and for good and sufficient reason. So my view on this is that whether or not President Trump is reelected, there's going to be continued forward momentum. There actually is a lot of bipartisan consensus, believe it or not, in Congress on a number of the clean technologies. I think we're going to see a fairly big energy bill move next year. I would predict that's going to have a lot of stuff on renewables, on energy storage, and on advanced nuclear and carbon capture and hydrogen and deep geothermal and all these other things I talked about tonight. So I think that you kind of have to separate the noise from the signal. And the long-term signal is, politically, we're moving towards a zero carbon regime, and it's just really a question of time. So I'm worried about the election, but in the short term, for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with the topic tonight. But I think over the long run, we're in good shape. And by the way, I don't think the US is leading the world anymore. I think the EU and China are probably leading the world, arguably more rhetorically than in reality. But as far as the laws and the directionality, I think that others have picked up the ball in the last 4 years.
And then our last question for the evening is, how do we convince climate skeptics, fiscal conservatives, and hedgehog thinkers that we need to take strong action on climate change, and that we need to do this with fox-like thinking to succeed?
Well, so this is a great question. So I don't think you really convince the hardcore. I just don't think you do. I think that's what we've learned in the last few years. In fact, there's some very interesting psychological research that shows if you give people who are, let's say, on the more conservative end of the political spectrum, more information about climate, they actually support climate action less, not more. It's sort of like, again, a cognitive bias or a selection bias, or motivated reasoning, or whatever you want to call it. So I don't think with the hardcore of folks who really don't believe climate's a problem, we're really going to get anywhere. I think what you do is, and I think this is why I'm somewhat optimistic, is if we reach out on the actual solution side, and this sounds kind of crazy, but if we talk about the solutions, rather than trying to get them to admit that they're wrong about the problem, we might actually make some progress. Some of the clean energy bills that have gotten through Congress in the last couple of years have had very conservative senators like Jim Inhofe and John Barrasso on them, along with very liberal pro-climate senators like Senator Whitehouse and Senator Booker. So, you know, I think that to the extent we can depolarize this by focusing on stuff that people all agree on, we'll get ahead. But I don't really think we need more advocacy on the problem. I think people are convinced there's a problem, and if they aren't convinced now, they're probably not going to be convinced by arguing with them, or you might even drive them in the opposite direction.
Thank you. I actually made a mistake. We have time for more questions, so okay. I can ask some other ones that we have. Your talk focused on technological solutions and high-level policies, but what can we do as individuals? What can institutions like Dickinson College do? What can our cities and local governments do?
Yeah, so I think that the, you know, I'll just fall back on this as a general rule, which is there are two things you can do. One is educate yourself and really make an effort to understand this issue. I know I threw a mind-numbing amount of information at you tonight, and I apologize for that if it was overwhelming, and I'll have more chance to interact with students in the coming weeks to kind of drill down on some of that material. But I do think educating yourself is really important, and as students, I think that's your number one job, is to really look at the evidence, learn as much as you can, and apply critical thinking. I think the other thing is, as citizens, we have a very, very significant role to play in, I mean, that's really our biggest role, right? These are big systems, and they're only going to change when people demand change. And large institutions, large corporations, and governments respond to citizen pressure. So in some sense, your biggest and most important contribution is as a voter or as an activist to support policy change. As far as, you know, the little things that you can do in your daily life, I'm not against that. I think actually it's good because to do that, because it makes you more conscious of and connects you to a larger set of issues. But I don't think it's a substitution for the big policy levers. You know, sometimes I say that you know, if you look at the fossil fuel power plants in the United States, there are only a couple thousand of them. You know, I mean, it's not like there's an infinite number of sources to regulate. So you may have a far bigger influence in supporting, you know, politicians who say they're going to regulate them than you might in, say, conserving a little bit of energy. Because in the end, if we can force the fossil fuel infrastructure to decarbonize or replace it with non-fossil resources, that's going to have a much bigger impact than anything you can do in your daily life. So I don't mean to discourage people from doing the little bits that you know, make your life more sustainable, but I think we're missing the big picture if we don't think of ourselves primarily as citizens.
That makes sense. Thank you. What are the policies or leverage points for interventions in our energy and economic systems that can bring about the multiple climate solutions you have discussed? Would raising the price of fossil energy with a carbon fee drive the changes we need, or do we need additional interventions or policies aimed at other leverage points?
Yeah, so I think you have to come at this from two directions. The first is, and I think I touched on this in my talk. So we need both something that constrains carbon emissions, because that will send important price signals to the market and to innovators. But we also need policies that affirmatively bring more options into the market. And the reason I say that is actually some experiences that I've lived through. So we've actually gotten a fair bit of the way with RD&D and with I would say more technology-based policies as opposed to carbon pricing per se. So let's look at for example, why do we have so much cheap wind and solar now? It's because states enacted policies that weren't really carbon prices, but what they did was they mandated a certain percentage of utility power increasingly to be provided by wind and solar. And so what happened was a huge amount of capital went into deploying wind and solar at scale. And like any technology, when you get to very big scale, you start reducing the unit cost. And you learn by doing and all kinds of things that drive the cost down. So I would say that in addition to pricing carbon or even regulating carbon directly, policies that bring new technologies into the market can be really important. Carbon pricing doesn't hurt, but one of the problems is it's kind of a blunt instrument. Let me give you an example. Let's say we had a $100 a ton carbon tax, which is a very, very big and politically difficult lift. I think in the last major climate bill before Congress, the target price was somewhere around $20 or $30. But let's say you get $100 per ton. Now that might make a big difference to gas-fired power plants. It probably double roughly the cost of gas-fired power. But for gasoline, not so much. It would add something like $1 per gallon to gasoline. So probably what would happen is people might drive smaller cars. There might be, some more electric cars, but it's not going to overnight really result in the kind of radical, quick technology change we need. So I think you need a combination of carbon-oriented policies and policies that drive or bring forward technology and drive the costs down. So those are the two big intervention levers, and I think there are almost infinite variations on each of those, but those are the two broad categories.
Thank you. This proposed portfolio is tech-heavy, and the heart of the environmental movement is tending towards a humanistic perspective and justice-based solutions. How do we meet these approaches in the middle?
It's a great question. I don't have an easy answer for you. I also don't believe that in a sense, that any particular technology cuts any particular way. I've been in northern Maine working on getting wind farms sited. And believe me, those people think they have a justice case for not siting wind farms anywhere near them. So it's to some extent, it's in the eye of the beholder. There are jobs issues associated with fossil energy. And, do we get rid of all fossil energy immediately, or do we repurpose fossil power plants with hydrogen? There's some communities that would say that's actually a good thing. We can retain jobs. So I don't think it's an easy question. And I think it's one that I think the amount of infrastructure we're going to have to build, no matter what we do. Let's say we go all hydrogen. There's a lot of pipelines. There's a lot of big industrial facilities that are going to have to be built. Where are they going to be built? I generally take the approach that the way this should be done, and I think we're going to have to start thinking about this a lot. We're exploring this in California right now, is we're going to need a lot more community engagement in siting of any new facilities of any kind, whether they're pipelines or transmission lines or renewable energy facilities, certainly nuclear power plants. There's going to need to be a lot of engagement. And we are seeing that happening in certain parts of the world, where instead of developing a project, going in and then seeking to persuade the community of something, you sort of start with the community and figure out what it is that they want and they can live with, and at what price, because there may need to be compensation for the inevitable amount of kit that we're going to actually have to build. So I think it's a very serious issue. I think that whatever we do, the footprint of the energy system is going to have to grow if we're going to go zero carbon. So I think it's going to have to be a lot of dialogue and a lot of thinking, and we're not going to be able to do business as usual. But I wish I had better answers. We're exploring a lot of that right now as we speak.
Thank you. Historically, energy transition has often resulted in energy addition to global energy usage, at least for oil, nuclear, and renewable energy. Do you think that a true energy transition is possible?
So I think the implicit question in the question is, can we continue to grow? Do we have to just reduce total energy use? Or is it not really a transition if we don't do that? I think yes. I think the answer is yes. I think that it could be a real zero carbon transition over a period of decades. To some extent, these are technical issues. They're political issues, but they're also technical. I don't see any reason, like in a logical sense, that we couldn't be zero if that's what we mean by a transition to zero carbon, and still be consuming a lot of energy. And in fact, I mean, it's not that we don't have time to go into it tonight, but there's certainly arguments that by substituting energy for other kinds of work, we actually can reduce an environmental footprint on the planet. Intense manufacturing, for example. So I think that I think there's not an easy answer to that question, but I think my answer would be, yeah, we can have a transition that where the planet is using more energy, and the footprint, the total footprint on the planet is much lighter. I just think if we do it in a smart way. I guess I also would ask another question, which is, if we say that we can't do a transition without reduced energy use, are we really dooming ourselves to failure? If we define that as success, I do fear that that's a possible outcome of taking that approach.
You mentioned how the graphs of future wind power is similar to the graphs of nuclear energy in the 70s. What role can government have in ensuring those mistakes are not made again?
Well, I certainly would like to, certainly would like to see this, both curves go up like that. And I think there's as you saw from those charts, there's plenty of room for both of them to expand at that rate. Look, it really comes down to two things. One is that we need continued support for that direction. And that means, and there are different policies for different technologies. I think with wind, solar, and storage, we need to continue to invest in expansion. And that means maintaining, support to commercialize those technologies, getting the technologies to a better place in terms of cost and performance. And I think that means continued, things like a clean energy standard that have been enacted in the States that would mandate increasing shares of energy coming from clean sources will help. Nuclear has its own particular set of challenges, and it's no secret that policymakers withdrew from that option in the mid, to late 1970s. I think we are resetting that policy. We're looking at a new generation of reactors. We're looking at a different kind of delivery model. The industry has to change. Maybe we need an entirely different industry if we're going to expand at that rate. So I think what policymakers can do, frankly, primarily, is set a direction and say, the law is zero carbon by X date. California said 2045. Some states have said 2050. Some states have said 80% by 2030. I think if we set that basic direction, a lot of the technology will follow, but we're also going to need some technology push strategies to maintain those kinds of arcs. The point in showing the arcs was not to say that we can't get very, very steep increases. Those arcs really represented predictions of what was going to be necessary if those sources were going to just completely dominate the energy system. If you take the view that we need to combine different things, those ramp rates would be significantly less dramatic, which I think would increase our chance of success.
Thank you. And that marks the last question and the end of our program. Thank you so much, Mr. Cohen. We really appreciate you coming and sharing with us, and we look forward to the rest of the semester.
Great. Well, thank you. As always, the students have the best questions and the hardest questions. So you're tougher than any Senate committee I've ever been in front of. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight, and I look forward to engaging on campus virtually.
We do too.
Okay.
And before we go, I just want to give a quick plug for those interested in continuing this conversation. On Wednesday, the Clark Forum is another event entitled The State of Environmental Justice in Pennsylvania, which I think is pressing and more needed than ever. So like I said, it'll be a panel discussion, and if you're interested in joining, please just go to the Clark Forum website to check out the details. So thank you so much, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.